Hey, thanks for joining me. I want to talk about professional wrestling, particularly the whole aspect of those who don't really know the industry and say, "Oh, it's all fake." Um, just a little bit of background here, I think is needed. I wouldn't call myself a massive wrestling fan, but I'm sufficiently into it to know most prominent wrestlers and some aspects of the industry, certainly some inside sort of information about terminology and so on. But by no means I don't want to present myself as like a hardcore wrestling fan. I'm not. I got into wrestling around the WWE, WWF as it then was, Attitude Era of the late 1990s and early 2000s, which was marketed as a really action-packed, quite gritty, slightly edgy storylines. But many people of my age tend to see the Attitude Era as something of a mini golden era in our lifetime. What happened in the late 2000s is the WWE, as it then was, because WWF had a legal dispute with the animal charity, the World Wildlife Fund, so they had to change the name. Around the late 2000s, I'm not sure exactly, I believe it was 2008, the WWE brought in a new code of conduct, sort of the PG introduction, as it's referred to, where they toned down everything. There would be no blood in the ring, there would be less sexual innuendo, there was a whole lot of things that changed. And a lot of fans didn't like that. They thought, well, I guess they felt it was less exciting, less action packed. So for a long time, from let's say the Attitude Era until really just a couple of years ago, so we're talking about early 2000s to late 2010s, I lost interest in professional wrestling. I wouldn't say it was totally like I never ever watched any footage, but definitely it went off my radar and I followed boxing much closer. I'm still much more of a boxing fan than a wrestling fan. Um, and I've been consistently a boxing fan. I've never really went off the interest, although there's been up and down times. I've consistently been interested in the sport boxing. With wrestling, like I say, it's kind of went up and down. Now, I remember so many big names from the Attitude Era, and a lot of those guys are still around now. Um, Steve Austin, of course, The Undertaker, Kane, The Rock, Triple H, the Hardy Boys, the Dudley Boys, Edge and Christian. Then the list goes on. There's so many big names, colorful characters of that era. There are a few characters of this era, and then there's those guys I would consider the crossover type era. I think John Cena is that actually, because I tend to associate John Cena more with the mid 2000s than with the Attitude Era. I don't think he was even around in the Attitude Era, but my history, may be wrong there. Brock Lesnar's another one. I tend to associate him a bit later than the Attitude Era, but a bit earlier than the current crop of big names, guys like Roman Reigns, Bray Wyatt, I don't know, Kevin Owens. And it's only been in the last 2 years I've been kind of picking up the interest again. So professional wrestling, firstly, wrestling takes many different formats. There's obviously Greco-Roman wrestling, which is done in the Olympics. Then there is Lucha Libre, I think it's called. Excuse me, I'm, I may be pronouncing that wrong, but it's the famous masked wrestling in Mexico, and that's very, very sacred to the Mexican people. It's a big, big part of their culture, and they take it so seriously that to unmask a wrestler is considered really taboo. Um, then, of course, there's Japanese wrestling, which is notoriously violent. Um, I watched a match. I forget the individuals involved, but one woman was looked like she almost killed the other woman. It was a very controversial incident, and the other woman's trainer actually attacked her out of fury because it was everyone thought she'd went too far. I forget the names now, but I want to talk about in ring risks and what these guys go through and why I think they need to be respected. Firstly, there is a staggeringly high number of professional wrestlers who die prematurely. I think it's the number one sport, in fact, for um, its participants dying before their time. I mean, it really is tragic the number of wrestlers who've died in their 30s, their 40s, and their 50s. Um, and you can't pin it down to one factor. I'm going to mention something which is it's still very taboo in the wrestling world, but I think it's just to reference it, the whole Chris Benoit thing. Um, that's probably the most notorious story incident in wrestling of modern times. I think it even surpasses the the death of Owen Hart or the Montreal Screwjob or any other major controversy. I think the Chris Benoit thing really blew a hole in the wrestling world. I mean, that's clear to see from the reaction of wrestlers, of wrestling insiders, of the company, of everyone involved. Um, and I understand that the autopsy on Chris Benoit found that this 40-year-old man had the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient, equivalent to that. I think there are a lot of and I remember seeing a discussion on the Larry King show. They had Chris Jericho, they had Steve Blackman, and several, I think Shawn Michaels was there. They had several, or Bret Hart it was. They had a lot of big names there to discuss the issues around this. And to a man, they resented the insinuation of steroids being any sort of factor there, like so-called roid rage. Um, there's still a lot of discrepancies about the Benoit case, things that don't add up. But I think it's disingenuous to say that steroid abuse isn't a problem in the wrestling industry. I mean, Hulk Hogan's said it's there. It's like any big sport. You get it in boxing as well. You get it in any performance enhancing drugs or something that is a problem in all major sports. Um, the thing about wrestling is obviously there's different levels. The WWE is the very epitome of the wrestling world. I mean, it's like the Olympics of the wrestling world, if you want to use that analogy. It's really the top of the top. There's all sorts of independent wrestling circuits. A friend of mine, well, I haven't been in touch with her for years, but she's a professional wrestler. She's in an independent circuit. I knew her when I was in sixth form. So there's many independent circuits all over the world, and the film The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke was featuring an independent circuit, presumably for copyright issues. They didn't want to get any issues from WWE. But one thing I liked about that film was its realism. It's been called the Rocky of wrestling, and I think Rourke's performance was great, but the whole story really showed that there is a sad side to the business. It's almost like and I don't mean this as any sort of disrespectful analogy, but it's almost like old circus performers. I mean, the life of a wrestler is not that different from circus performers of the past because they're traveling around, they're under constant pressure to perform, to be entertainers, and wrestling more than any other sport is about entertainment. So it's over the top, it's exaggerated, it's what's known in the wrestling world as kayfabe storylines. With boxing, performance is solely focused on athletic ability, i.e., how fast your hands are, how tough you are, how you could take a punch, that sort of thing. But no one really, there's no gimmick with boxing. Some fighters may have colorful entrance themes. I mean, Prince Nazim, for example, used to be very colorful. But, a great fighter in boxing doesn't necessarily need to be a great entertainer. I mean, there's many great fighters that could be called somewhat boring in terms of their personality, but they're great fighters. Now, the world of wrestling is different in the sense that they have to be entertainers. They have to be actually actors in the sense of coming out with great, I forget the wrestling term, but, talking, they need to be able to convince the crowd that there's menace, to enhance a kayfabe storyline. And some of the most successful wrestlers have been great on the mic. Guys like The Rock, Triple H, Edge, they're all great at working the mic. I never followed the WCW era, but I tend to associate that with big muscle men, like Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. And some of them were very entertaining performers, but I think the storylines over the years have got more complex. The WCW era, or the WCW, um, to me, it was a bit almost like a child's caricature of a wrestler. Whereas the WWE, in my opinion, the storylines are a bit more complex, and sometimes I think they're definitely borderline. I mean, McMahon is kind of like the Don King of the wrestling world. Vince McMahon is a very controversial figure. There's definitely been moral questions about some of the storylines, even if they are storylines where you get, women being beaten up, or I was reading something earlier about proposed incest lines that thankfully the WWE never went with. But definitely they do skate close to the edge sometimes in what's acceptable, even in the PG era. But what I think people need to understand is that, and it is the same with boxing, people judge wrestlers, boxers, and other martial artists by their performance in the ring, i.e., on the night of the fight. And in the world of wrestling, with the performance in the ring, um, with the whole bout. Again, my wrestling terminology fails me here, but what happens in the ring? People are judged by that. How good of a performer are they? How good a fighter are they? What the general public don't see, what fans don't see, is what it takes to get to the top in the gym. In the gym, I think that is hugely underestimated. I mean, even in the world of boxing, we might, for example, occasionally see Anthony Joshua in workout videos, but most people don't realize that for a boxer, for example, most of the pain and the pressure, the physical pressure that they go through, I would say is not in the fights themselves, but is what they put themselves through physically in the gym and in other training programs. Going a 10-mile run at 5 a.m. in the morning, that's, um, as I believe Carl Froch used to do. That's what it takes. And that's why most people cannot be at that sort of level, because it's incredibly physically demanding. When there's been boxing deaths recently, it's been pointed out that there's not enough focus on what actually happens in the gym. I remember when Adonis Stevenson was hospitalized, and thankfully it looks like there's some good news from that. But when he was hospitalized, there was again a lot of discussions in Canadian media. And one thing that was mentioned by the son of George Chavallo, who was a great Canadian fighter, was that there isn't enough analysis on what actually happens in sparring. On the surface, sparring is supposed to be like practice fighting, where you get a guy who's usually an average fighter or a journeyman who's there to kind of help um, a top fighter prepare for a big bout. But sparring, it's meant, on paper, it's meant to be that you go somewhat lightly, but there may well be headshots that go on in sparring that are not documented, that people don't see in the ring. So that sort of thing maybe needs to be analyzed. Maybe there needs to be more scrutiny of what goes on in the gym, not necessarily in the ring. Because, say, for example, a guy gets a blood clot and it takes time to, I don't know the science of it, but let's say that occurs in the gym. Then he has a fight the next day, and then he's knocked out and he ends up in a coma. People will assume it's something that's happened in the fight, but it may well be that something that happened in the fight kind of just triggered a pre-existing condition. So I think it's similar in the wrestling world. I mean, Chris Benoit he used to be an incredibly skilled athlete at the sort of things that he would do. He took an awful lot of headshots. I mean, I think the wrestling world in particular, there's enormous pressure on wrestlers to constantly be, on top form. Um, During that Larry King thing, they denied that because there was people emailing to ask questions, they denied that there was any sort of bias towards bigger guys, like muscle men. I think that's probably more true today than I think in the past, like the 80s, there was a bias towards huge guys. But there has been some very skilled wrestlers who have done well, and they're not massive guys. I mean, the Hardy brothers, for example, they're probably bigger than the average guy, but as wrestlers go, I would say they're not massive guys. And then you get guys like Hornswoggle. I mean, he has dwarfism, but he's done pretty well for himself in the wrestling world. So I would agree that probably entertainment is the number one thing overlooked, but I do think that both in wrestling and boxing, there perhaps needs to be more support for fighters who kind of fall off the radar. I mean, there's enormous pressure at top level, but I think there needs to be more support of guys that kind of fall off the radar, whether they lose a title, whether they're no longer invited to promotions, because then it turns into a vicious cycle. They get depressed, maybe they start drinking, using drugs. Um, and I don't know if the support is necessarily given to them. I think, for example, in the world of boxing, um, there should be help available, counselling or something like that, specifically sports counselling, because that's very specific, available. And the British Boxing Board of Control and other sanctioning bodies should be providing that. Now, I don't know what the situation is. Maybe they are, but I mean, boxing has also had its fair share of guys suffering mental health problems, alcoholism, drug abuse. I still think that if it's a choice between ending up as a street thug and being in a gang and maybe being shot at the age of 21 or possibly going on to be a world champion, that's a choice for many fighters from difficult backgrounds. It's very obvious what the preference would be. And obviously, they're not going to get into a sport like tennis. So, um, I think you have to give boxing credit for giving a lot of guys a vacuum to put all that anger and give them a drive for something. The truth of the matter is, in both boxing and wrestling, most people are not going to get to the very top. Most people will be lucky if they get a significant amount of attention. But I think the general public now, in terms of just to get back to the point about, oh, is it fake? Well, that's understandably something wrestlers hate to hear. And on more than one occasion, some wrestlers have blown a casket. One guy, I think it was Big Van Vader, actually served some time in Kuwait because he attacked the TV presenter who insinuated that. Um, the thing is, yes, there's storylines. Yes, it's scripted, and wrestlers work together in a way that boxers don't. Boxers are fighting, and the other guy doesn't know what they're going to do. They might have some idea if they've watched videos and so on, but there's no kind of correspondence between the two fighters. In wrestling, they actually whisper what's going to happen. There's a whole choreography to it, but the stunts are very real, and mistakes can happen. Guys have had broken necks, broken collarbones, etc., and women fighters as well. There's been some very real injuries, and people, I sort of see wrestlers as like stunt people on a film set because that is the sort of risks they take, and it's all for entertainment. So when people, that's why I got annoyed when people were booing Roman Reigns that time when he announced leukemia. Some people were actually booing him, like they thought it was part of the storyline or something. Um, I think in the end of the day, we need to recognize these guys are not supermen. Some of them are very impressive. Some of them are huge guys. Um, but they're not supermen. In the end of the day, they're human beings, and I think we can put them in this almost mythical status. Like there used to be those kids' toys, like the Ultimate Warrior. There was a man behind that, a human being who, you know. So I mean, wrestling fans are very enthusiastic. The whole business of wrestling it's like show business. It's very colorful. It's very exaggerated. And it's certainly, I mean, when you look at boxing, you look at wrestling by comparison. In fact, the actor Mickey Rourke said that he initially was reluctant to take on the role because he looked down on wrestling, but he soon changed his mind when he learned about the industry. The thing about wrestling is they do stunts that boxers don't do. You know, boxer's never going to get up on the ropes and jump onto his opponent. Um, there's risks in both sports, but in different ways. So I just think that the public need to understand this, and they need to respect what these men and women go through, because it really is profound, and it's all for entertainment. Well, with wrestling, it's all for entertainment. With boxing, it's all for being the best and getting to the top. But even at middle level, even in wrestling in the independent circuits, in boxing at non-championship so-called journeyman level, every time someone enters the ring, there is risks, and I think people need to respect that.